History as it happens, April 6, 2021. A war without victors.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Every American can recite the words of FDR's address to Congress, but what if 25 years earlier an American president had made different decisions? What if Woodrow Wilson brought an end to the First World War in 1916? The entire 20th century might have turned out differently. It's a story of human bravery and folly, of choices made and opportunities lost, and it resonates today. That's next as we report history as it happens. A podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
This is the turning point of the war. This is the turning point of world history. Because if you end the war at this stage, with the leaders trying to get out of it, there is no Bolshevik takeover in Russia.
The First World War was a tragic and unnecessary conflict. Unnecessary because the train of events that led to its outbreak might have been broken at any point during the 5 weeks of crisis that preceded the first clash of arms, had prudence or common goodwill found a voice. And that, my friends, is the late John Keegan, the opening 2 sentences of his masterpiece on the Great War, the conflict that set Europe on a dark course from which it would emerge in ruins in 1945. It was unnecessary, and there was nothing inevitable either about the maelstrom that swept away the lives of some 10 million soldiers and millions more civilians. Better choices were available in July 1914. Better choices were available in 1916, the subject of this episode. As one of my favorite scholars, Christopher Clark, often says, the subject may be old, but the issues are fresh. So let's keep that front of mind, especially if you assume there's nothing more to learn about this story. So we know the First World War ended in 1918, but what most of us did not know until now is the war might have ended with a negotiated peace 2 years earlier, long before the first U.S. soldiers stepped foot in Europe. That's according to former diplomat and now University of Virginia historian Philip Zelikow, whose exciting new book, The Road Less Traveled, reveals efforts by Germany to compel Wilson to initiate peace talks. This happened at a time when all the warring powers were looking for a way out.
It failed because, in some ways, some of the key players at the center just did not know how to do it.
If you've been a regular listener to this podcast, you know I love to use audio from the archives, but that's kind of hard to do for World War I for obvious reasons. However, the earliest known recording of a live radio broadcast dates to November 10th, 1923. That's 1 day short of the 5th anniversary of Armistice Day, marking the end of the war. And C-SPAN has given us the okay to use a short clip of that radio address, made by an aging, ill Woodrow Wilson. The audio is a bit difficult to understand.
Our associates, refuse to bear any responsible part in the administration of peace.
Wilson laments the failure of the United States to join the League of Nations. He called it shameful, the way we turned our backs upon our associates and refused to bear any responsible part in the administration of peace. Wilson made no mention of his own mistakes, not after the war, but during it, when he had an opportunity, as we've said, to bring the warring powers to the peace table. And that failure of diplomacy has escaped the attention of most historians until now. Philip Zelikow is the White Burkitt Miller Professor of History at the University of Virginia. He worked in 5 presidential administrations as a diplomat, and you might recognize his voice. He joined this podcast a couple of weeks ago to talk about the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, but now he's back to talk about his new book. As mentioned, The Road Less Traveled, The Secret Battle to End the Great War. Philip Zelikow, welcome back to the podcast. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Martin.
Seeing you over our Zoom connection, speaking to you in the minds of our listeners. So an old friend used to give me a hard time about reading books about certain subjects. He would say, why do you keep reading about the First World War? Is there anything you could possibly learn, anything new at this point? I think I know how you would answer him, so let's start with the premise of your new book, the efforts to bring about peace in 1916 that you say have been overlooked or ignored by almost all historians in the past century. So how did you learn about these efforts and come to write about them?
Yeah, actually, the argument of the book is so enormous that the natural reaction that I would have as a historian is incredulity. Oh, come on. How could you come up with such a big argument that says the whole way we understand why America got into the war, the reason the war continued, needs to be reshaped? Surely this should have come out decades ago. Look, I shared that incredulity. One of the founding scholars on this subject, who had one of the key books about this, a now deceased historian named Ernest May, helped me discover this in the late 2000s. We were going through some other materials and ran across in the German evidence again, evidence that the Germans had made this peace move in 1916, asking Wilson to mediate an end to the war. And then we noticed a lot of recent evidence that the British had actually been much more pessimistic about the war than people realized, and they were considering some stuff. And we began pulling, like, what actually did happen with the German peace move? And just began pushing that question hard. And Ernest, who had written one of, I think, like the three fundamental accounts of the second generation of historiography of how America got into the war, published at the end of the 1950s, we looked at it and agreed, man, there's something gigantic here. This needs a really new look. This was at the end of the 2000s. And Ernest died shortly thereafter, and I've been chipping away on this project ever since. I think this book actually probably could have been written even 40 years ago, because I think a lot of the key evidence to make it possible has now been available for some time. But to do it, you needed to pull together not only the German evidence, compare that with American evidence that became available later, especially the unexpurgated diaries of Edward House. And the last set of evidence to become available was the British evidence, which became available mainly in the 1970s and 80s. But to come back really with the core question, why didn't people see this story? The main reason people didn't see this story is because they didn't know it existed. The German peace move was entirely secret at the time. And all the negotiations surrounding the German peace move in 1916 and early 1917 were utterly secret. So the world really had no idea of the full story here, and very few historians, in fact, are even aware of the German peace move at all. They know of some German peace feelers in 1917 made through intermediaries. No. This one in 1916, this is formal from the top of the German government straight to Woodrow Wilson. This is absolutely at the center, at the top of their governments. Wilson totally knows about it. The British actually learned about it right away, though they weren't supposed to know about it, etc. But no one knew about this in the 1920s. The Germans actually had their own investigation of what had gone wrong with their peace move, but it was conducted entirely among Germans. And it was very quickly clouded by the gigantic attention given to 1914 and the outbreak of the war, and the big war guilt debates that continue to this day, and on which libraries have been written. So the whole first generation of scholarship about the war is, when you focus on diplomacy, only really looked at the outbreak of the war or the Versailles Peace Conference. This key episode in the middle of the war, most people did not even know existed. The British and Americans who knew better had no interest in calling it out. Edward House, when he published an edited version of his diaries in the interwar period, actually carefully edited out all the key material from his diaries that would have shown what the Germans were putting on the table. So people didn't understand this at all. And really only recently have I and a few other scholars begun revisiting this evidence and realizing this staggering story that's there.
And you believe we've had a fundamental misunderstanding of how the United States got into the war?
I mean, the fundamental argument is, why did America enter the war? Most people would answer, well, the U-boat war. That fundamental story is fundamentally misconceived. Germans only adopted the U-boat war because their peace move had failed. The peace move that they had been negotiating for 5 months had failed. A set of negotiations that the British were aware of and participated in at the same time the British were trying to get out of the war. So if you ask historians, do you know that the Germans tried to end the war? Mostly they don't know. Do you know the Germans were willing to do a compromise peace, offering to restore Belgium? Mostly they don't know. Do you know that the British were also trying to get out of the war. And even if they didn't want to get out of the war, they were about to go bankrupt and the funds to continue it. No, they don't know that either. And that the Americans had all this in their hands, that the French were also looking for a way out of the war, all in secret. There's this colossal story as to why the war widened. And it's not just a story of interest to Americans. It's not just America got into the war because the peace talks failed. And the U-boat war was the consequence of that. It's also that this is the pivot point. This is the turning point of the war. This is the turning point of world history. Because if you end the war at this stage with the leaders trying to get out of it, there's no Bolshevik takeover in Russia. No historian sees that as plausible. All sorts of things get avoided if you end the war at this turning point instead of widening it. And they came tantalizingly close. The failure of the peace talks was not because the positions of the two sides were fundamentally irreconcilable. They actually were obviously reconcilable when you study the record closely. It failed because, in some ways, some of the key players at the center, one, just did not know how to do it.
Mm-hmm. You make that point about Woodrow Wilson.
Then there's a fascinating story on the British side.
And we're going to get into those fascinating details about what was going on behind the scenes in each of these countries. But let's start with an overview of the general situation in 1916, especially after the summer offensives failed to produce victory. The major powers are becoming exhausted, they're out of fresh ideas to win the war, and their publics are getting antsy, publics that don't know the whole truth about the extent of their problems. So Philip Zelikow, pick it up from there.
That summary is dead right. So 1916, that's the year of Verdun. That's the year of the Somme. By the end of the summer of 1916, as you just pointed out, all the sides saw no good military option for ending the war. They were also utterly exhausted. The war by this time had already cost more than any other war in human history, any war that any of these countries had ever experienced. In a way, an inspiring part of this story is people have this image of these blind leaders who just persist in a foolish war in these trench stalemate and endless horror. The popular image in Britain was heroes led by donkeys. And in fact, the story reveals that the leaders of the warring powers mostly did want to find a way out of the war. They were looking for a way out, but they were looking for a way out utterly in secret. They were presenting this impassive, patriotic face to their publics, but they, in fact, were trying to find a way out, and they almost pulled it off. So you've got the basic framing right. And so the ideal way out is through a compromise peace. Most of the leaders of the key warring powers were ready for the compromise peace and even outlined how it would work, mostly going back to the borders before the war, with a few adjustments, an independent Poland. Russia has rights through the Dardanelles Straits into the Mediterranean. The shape of the compromise peace, what people at the time called a peace of understanding, was there. Each side would then be able to claim success because each side all thought and said they were fighting a war of self-defense. Their publics, and this is hard for others to understand, but the Germans thought they were fighting a war of self-defense. They actually believed that. They'd been invaded by Russia, etc. The French thought it was a war of self-defense. The British thought it was a war of self-defense. So in a way, the narrative of success for all of them is, look, we blunted the aggressor and we defended ourselves. We saved our countries. And they could all have that narrative in a compromised peace.
That's right. That's a key piece of your book, how each of the warring powers claim to be fighting in self-defense, sort of like watching a football game and each team is playing defense at the same time. But it did have a logic in 1916. However, in each of these countries, there were powerful forces counteracting peace sentiment. And you cite a scholar in your book, Jorn Leonard, who wrote a terrific book about the war a couple of years ago, Pandora's Box. Here's the citation. During 1916, the high death toll actually reinforced the military's doctrine of the offensive. The war continued because any yielding, any compromise, any renunciation of unconditional victory would devalue all the past sacrifices and call into question the legitimacy of the nations at war. The war fed on itself, as it were. Each new sacrifice prolonged the conflict by hardening the resolve on all sides to win the victory that would give sense to the sacrifice. None of the military commanders could free themselves from this logic. That was the citation. And the military leaders were at odds with their civilian leadership.
Right. And the image people have is that the military was driving the show. But the answer is actually they were not. The civilian leaders got to try their hand at peace. It was only when their peace efforts failed that then the military had its way. So, for instance, in Germany, where we have this image of the dictatorial German high command. One of the fascinating characters in my book is the German Chancellor, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg. Bethmann is now a neglected figure slipping into the shadows. To the extent people know about him at all, they blame him for some of his negligence in the outbreak of the war in 1914, a war that took the life of his son later in 1914, by the way, and leaving Bethmann with a sense of guilt that tormented him, as I quote in the book. But Bethmann stood up to the military successfully for a year and a half.
Incredible.
Beginning in the middle of 1915, he resisted every effort to widen the U-boat war. He resisted every effort to bring America into the war. And then by the summer of 1916, he developed the peace move. He arranged for and got the defeat and resignation of the famous leader of the German Navy, Tirpitz. He arranged and got the dismissal of the leader of the German army, von Falkenhayn. He brought in some popular generals from the East, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, but he brought them in specifically, as he told the Kaiser, and I have this in the book. He says, I'm bringing these people in because they're popular. I can arrange a face-saving peace with these popular generals in place. The Kaiser agreed. Bethmann lined up the key political factions in Germany for a compromise. He coordinated the peace move with his allies, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, and pursued this with the self-defense narrative in view for 5 months. And then finally, the Kaiser and the military gave up on Wilson. And they adopted the U-boat war because after 5 months, Bethmann's peace move seemed to have failed, even though Bethmann himself, right to the end, kept going with it. And at the very end, there is this amazing story of Wilson actually having 2 different messages, one effectively from Bethmann on how to continue the peace talks, and the other effectively from the German military on the U-boat war. And in his anger at the latter, he dismissed the former.
So, Kaiser Wilhelm, I'm glad you brought him up. He was not a warmonger. He was willing to listen to his chancellor. And if you look at a map in 1916, the Germans aren't doing as badly as their adversaries. I mean, everyone's suffering a catastrophe, of course, but on the map, the German front lines aren't in bad shape. And they're actually, as you point out, fairly generous in their peace terms.
Right. The Americans and the British both had excellent information that was accurate, that Bethmann was prepared to restore Belgium. Actually, he privately and told the Austrians that he expected to also withdraw from all of France. And then they would try to get some gains in the East. They would try to create an independent Poland out of former Russian Poland to serve as a buffer between the Russian Empire and Germany. They would try to rearrange some matters in the Balkans. But fundamentally, Bethmann sold this using analogies to the way Prussia survived the 7 Years' War in the 1700s. Our enemies encircled us and sought to destroy the new Germany. Germany will have survived. And if Germany survives this war against that encirclement, this will be a tremendous victory. And that argument basically was an argument that most of Germany was prepared to buy, and it's why they supported his peace move. The Kaiser, a neurotic, unstable figure, but believing that the war needed to end in order to save his monarchy, And the Austria-Hungary also eager to end the war on just these sorts of terms. And Wilson had very good information from the start about the German readiness to compromise. He hadn't even demanded these compromises, and they were offering it. They were offering it, and they were focusing on Wilson, of course, for a good reason. It was an American president who had mediated an end to the last great power war, the war between Russia and Japan of 1904-05. Theodore Roosevelt mediated an end to that war. This was a much harder problem, but everyone at the time had this precedent in mind, and the Americans could bring everyone to the table. They had absolute financial leverage over the Allies, and Wilson had already begun using that leverage, effectively cutting off the flow of more funds to the Allies in November 1916 in order to advance the peace process, which he then flubs.
Yes, the British and French were borrowing money from J.P. Morgan to keep their war efforts going. I found Woodrow Wilson very frustrating as I read your book. He vacillates, he delays. It looks like he's going to make his peace move early in 1916, then he puts it off until after the election. When he finally has a good working document in hand, he allows his informal advisor, Edward House, to water it down. He didn't have strong advisors. In fact, on foreign policy, it seems he had no strong advisors at all. But he still dropped the ball here, pardon the cliche. He wasn't running blind. He had good information, as you say, to act on.
That's well put, Martin. But as you know, the character of Wilson that I offer in the book is actually a very interesting person. This is not the cartoon image of kind of the foolish, woolly-headed, way too idealistic Wilson. In fact, he's a centrist in the American debate, maneuvering to try to find the middle ground, and actually politically quite successful. He's quite dispassionate, even, and quite realistic, in fact. I'm not going to enter into moral judgments about who's right and wrong in the war. The war needs to end with a compromise peace in which neither side gets a clear victory. In a way, at the level of grand strategy, Wilson is extraordinarily far-sighted and perceptive. By the way, in arranging the financial maneuvers to put the financial pressure on the Allies to bring them to the peace table, Wilson orchestrates all that himself, working with his Federal Reserve Board. His advisor, Edward House, isn't even aware that it's happened and doesn't understand it. And Wilson handled that quite well. But then Wilson's idiosyncrasies come to the fore when it came to the operational task of exactly how to do the diplomacy to bring the war to an end. He just doesn't know how to do it. It is possible for a person to be brilliantly perceptive in diagnosing a problem and yet be incompetent in the mechanics of how to solve it. And where I think contemporary readers may find the book interesting is this is a book that basically demystifies statecraft and gets you into the nitty-gritty of, look, if you want to solve a giant problem, here's how to go about it. And as a former diplomat, I try to walk people through, here's how you would do it. And people at the time understood this, but Wilson didn't understand it. He surrounded himself with a tiny inner circle where he's really looking for advice, really just from Edward House, who is a mediocre amateur dilettante.
Has no office, has no formal appointment.
Correct. Private citizen who has a veneer of cosmopolitan sophistication, but under it actually very little competence or judgment of his own, who it turns out is privately dissembling in various ways. And that's Wilson's one sounding board. So Wilson is experimenting with how to make this up, borrowing ideas from newspaper editorials. He has a crucial operational idea, which is to call for the peace conference and then arrange it. House gets him to take that out. Wilson then comes up with a feckless peace note that he makes public that asks people to explain their war aims, which puzzles everyone involved on both sides. He then realizes that that's been a bust. He comes up with a different, but finally, what happens then is some of the professionals start trying to patiently instruct them, look, here's how to do it. The German ambassador starts kind of trying to, here's how to do this. Even the British intelligence agent, William Wiseman, who has obtained extraordinary access to House, even he's kind of trying to instruct House, and here's how you should do this. House talks to Herbert Hoover, the great humanitarian relief coordinator. Hoover immediately begins, oh, look, here's how you do it. British parliamentarians are writing to Wilson to explain how to do it. Yet Wilson, he's misled by otherwise very good editorials in the New Republic. Finally, at the very end, he's beginning to figure it out, just beginning to figure out how to do it. But the German high command has run out of patience with him. And Bettmann lost his battle to stop the declaration of the U-boat war. And then you have this amazing story in which Bettmann tries to continue the peace talks with one message. The high command opens the U-boat war with another message. Wilson ignores the Bettmann message because he's so angry about the U-boat message.
You mentioned the New Republic. It seemed at one point that Wilson, yes, was taking his lead from a couple of journalists, just not any journalists, 27-year-old Walter Lippmann, but still, this is the President of the United States trying to potentially mediate the end to the worst war ever, following the lead of a couple of writers in the New Republic.
Oh, that's well put, Martin, by the way. That's very nice.
You write near the end of your book, Wilson failed because he simply did not know how to do it, as you just said here. He was the rookie who sits down at the poker game and dealt a hand with 3 kings, throws back 2 of them in the hope of getting better cards. We've yet to speak in detail about the British in this story. I found them frustrating too, especially David Lloyd George, the great prime minister who leads his nation to victory in 1918. But in 1916, what a pain in the neck. At first, he supports a peace move, and then he wants to put it off until after the summer offensives. And then he makes public statements that aren't very helpful, and he's scheming for power. All of this happening while there's this intense internal debate at the top of the British government.
Right again, Martin.
I read your book. I hope I'm getting these things right.
That Lloyd George is a fascinating figure. This book, I think, a major audience for this book will be in Britain. The British story in this book is absolutely fascinating and has not been fully told. There's another very good young British historian who will have a book coming out later this year, Dan Larson, in his book Plotting for Peace, that will also reinforce my portrait of a lot of the British story and complement it in some nice ways. But the British story is amazing. I think that once people fully digest what Lloyd George did in all of this, they may have to post guards on his crypt in Westminster Abbey.
Not helpful all the time.
No, he's in many ways, he is an architect of the peace move and also its saboteur. He is in public Mr. Fight to the finish, yet in private, he is the most eloquent denouncer of the war effort. He knows the war effort can't go on, that Britain is running out of money, that the strategy isn't going to work, and he's preparing a peace parachute, but using the whole crisis over the war to manipulate himself into a position of supreme power in Britain. A fascinating portrait, but I think it's fundamentally a devastating portrait of the leadership he offered and why Britain lost its chance, because most of the British population does not know that in the fall of 1916, the British cabinet had fundamental debates about whether it could continue in the war or seek a peace negotiated through Wilson. And that debate was actually fully squared off in just as fundamental terms as that in November of 1916, when Lloyd George then uses that debate to create a cabinet crisis over fake personnel and process issues in order to put himself into supreme power.
And let's remind our listeners that at this point in 1916, no one sees an end to the war. We know today it ends in 1918. We know how it ends. But in 1916, unless someone sues for peace or proposes a peace move, no one sees a military breakthrough ending the war anytime soon. So all the warring powers get so close, they're waiting for Wilson to do something. 1916 turns into 1917. And I'm asking myself as I read your book, why don't Britain, France, and Germany just handle this themselves?
The reason is that no side could afford publicly to make it sound like they were ready to quit. No one wanted to show weakness to the other, because then they feared that would just make the war go on longer. Yeah. As the other side was emboldened to try to push a little harder to get victory. So they all knew they needed a neutral mediator to offer them a faith-saving way out. They couldn't afford, one side could not afford to sue for peace. What they needed was for Wilson to say, will you all come to a peace conference? And then they could all say yes. It would have been his initiative, his invitation, but then they could all say yes to that, knowing that once they got to a peace conference, the basic situation would end up driving the answer. And at the time, people realized that Wilson was the person who could do it. And Wilson realized this too, which is what makes really the story so tragic.
Tragic indeed. So let's wrap up with this. Why is this story relevant today? As a scholar, as a former diplomat, why do the choices that were not made in 1916 resonate today? As, say, we look at the United States still trying to extract itself 20 years later from wars in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Well, I think mostly these issues of how to solve giant problems without blowing things up are eternal issues. This just happens to be an amazing story of an effort to solve as big a problem as there was out there without blowing it all up. And the amazing part of it is they almost do. So then to do that in a way by taking the reader through, like, here's how these people tried to solve this problem. Look how they could have done it. Look how close they came, is then a way of instructing anyone, okay. In a way, it inspires you and informs you on how to approach the problem solving of our own age.
Philip Zelikow, diplomat and scholar, thank you for your great insights today, and congrats again on your new book. You know, I understand it can be easy to get carried away with counter-historicals and what-ifs. Had Wilson acted when he had the chance in late 1916 and brought the war to an end? No one can really say for sure, though, how the rest of the 20th century would have gone, or whether that peace would have lasted any longer than the peace that actually came in 1919. Regardless where you fall in this debate, the takeaway here is the importance of contingency in history, human agency. There are always choices. Different outcomes are possible. History never moves in a straight line. On the next episode of History as It Happens, filibuster schmilibuster.
If the right of free and open debate is taken away from the minority party and the millions of Americans who ask us to be their voice, I fear that the already partisan atmosphere in Washington will be poisoned to the point where no one will be able to agree on anything.
The fight for the filibuster and its rather inglorious past. Next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.